honour to be speaking today with Yona Lee. And Yona is the gallery's Aotearoa New Zealand visiting artist for 2020. She arrived here in November last year and has spent 12 weeks working out of the studios and workshops at the Dunedin School of Art. And that period of time has culminated in this exhibition, Succession, and all 23 works that are in the show have been made over that 12-week period while Yona's been in Dunedin. So we thought today we're going to have a sort of Q&A format. I've got a series of questions for Yona, and at the end we'll leave room for any questions from the audience. So Yona's work moves between large-scale site-specific installations and more discrete, smaller sculptures. And both of which, in different ways, are very much responsive to architecture and context. Yona completed an MFA at the School of Fine Arts at Auckland University in 2010. And so I wondered, as a starting point, Yona, were you focusing on sculpture at art school?
I think when I applied to go like my portfolio was full of like paintings and drawings, and as a student you get so influenced by who the tutors that you work with, and I happened to work with these two very important artists, New Zealand artists, Gutsell and Peter Robinson, my first year. And both of them to work with sculpture and objects, and there's kind of they put stress, like importance in like the space relationship with an object. It really influenced me, and ever since then I just kept working with objects and sculpture and installation.
And was the site-specific nature of your practice and the way that you play with scale, was that starting to develop at that time?
I think that site-specificness of my work, the concept of space has always sort of like linked back to my training as a cellist when I was really young. Because as a classical cellist, like it's very site-specific, like you always perform every time in different space, different audience, and how you feel at the time always changes, like despite you playing the same piece. So like I remember like kind of like studying at the Elam, and I struggled with an idea of this kind of ready-made object kind of moving in different spaces without adapting to different contexts. And now I have a better idea and understanding of that context, but I was so used to this idea of like performing every time with the audience, like in live, and that is such a huge pleasure in performing, is that kind of sense of like direct communication with the audience. And sometimes I felt like an object in gallery felt quite dead in that way, and I think that concept sort of like led to this idea of like the functionality in the work. I like the idea of like as if the work was just made, or like as a living entity, rather than as a object that was made like in history. And anyways, I think that concept of like site-specific, this kind of response to space, kind of developed at the time I was training as a cellist, because as a performer, you it's not just about you, like it's about the composer, it's about the piece. And I recall at the time when I was given a new piece to study, like I would read about the composer of the 18th century, like read about the history and the context and the political climate at the time, when the composer composed the piece, and really trying to like understand the what the composers might have gone through at the time, and also being able to somehow have your own perspective of the piece. And so there was kind of really interesting sort of relationship between this composer and this performer, like it's almost like coexisting at the same time. And I think I bring that perspective when I have an exhibition. I approach the space like I really want the space to speak, because I think when you have this kind of ideal, like if you start to neglect the space and prioritize your work so much, it just becomes too like you kill the space. And I think when you give the space to speak and let it breathe, it sort of supports the work, and at the same time, and I quite like that coexisting idea. So like when I work on each show, one of the element that confirms me whether the show is successful is when the space, when you work on the show and then you install, and then you get to a point where the space somehow speaks back to you, and like somehow the space or the context somehow completing the work. There's a sort of sense, and when that happens, I get really satisfied. I feel like the work is sort of like accepted by the space, or like embraced by it.
Yeah, that was interesting last night. At the opening, people were talking about how the work felt like it was sort of very much coming out of the walls through the space, and sort of forcing them to walk around, which was one of the things you were hoping it would do, is people would sort of go from work to work, but it really is part of the building, sort of like coming out. And so what drew you to your use of industrial, utilitarian, sort of commercial materials, artistic materials?
I think in my last year at art school, I sort of started working with like metal, like at the time it was like metal sheets, like folded in structure, and that's when I actually started like learning soldering and like cuttings, but it wasn't anything like professional level, you know, like in art school you learn like these techniques, but they're never like up in the professional level. So like, but it sort of started there. But then I was very lucky because, you know, you have all these kind of support and facility at art school, and once you leave, you lose that. You lose a technician, you lose all the workshops, and you start thinking, how can I sustain practice when I don't have these facilities? Unless you're like a painter where you can just have your room, and when you need these tools, then like and what would you do? And I was really lucky last year. I had a show with my friend at George Fraser, which is a part of Elam Gallery, and my friend's uncle owned a doorknob company in Auckland, and he was a very interesting character. He had this really strange idea of like making lots of money from art, and he approached me and he invited me to come to his company, and telling me, you know, we can make your work in a very sleek way, and it sort of that kind of led me a step into his doorknob company, and I made friends with the manager, and which was like 2010, at the end of 2010, and I built that. And he's left. He passed on the company to another owner, but I maintained the relationship. Like it's been like over like it's almost like 10 years now. So like then, you know, it's a doorknob company, so that the level of fabrication is like, you know, at the commercial level. So like I started to learn like the welding skills, and kind of learning the fabrication, very, the standard of like commercial level, which is very lucky. And then that sort of led to looking at other companies and supporting my practice. And I think just looking at them, what they make, and you get influenced by the materials they use and the skills and so on.
I think it's a good, it's a precursor to this exhibition and residency. It's good to talk a little bit about In Transit, which is a series of works that Yona first in transit work in 2016 while in residency in Korea, and then since then it's had 5 iterations, both in New Zealand and overseas, at Tutuhi in Auckland, Alternative Space Loop in Korea, City Gallery Wellington, Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney, and most recently towards the end of last year at the Lyon Biennale. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that series, sort of how it came about.
So I had opportunity to do a residency in Korea in 2016, and at the time, as an artist, you work on like series of work, and you get to a point where you need to sort of develop or like make a new project. So I was at that point, and I wanted to kind of use that opportunity because I was originally from Korea, and it was my first going back as an artist, and I want to use the opportunity to somehow kind of embrace my kind of background, and I started thinking about the difference of living in 2 different countries, and the big contrast between living in Korea and New Zealand was how spaced out New Zealand was. Because in Korea you have big population with small land, and in contrast to New Zealand, and what that leads to people in Korea is that how inventive you become in terms of how you utilize small spaces, and there's this industrial area in Seoul called kind of Uchiro, where it's a kind of industrial area full of streets of like hundreds of like tiny shops. They sell like there's one full street that sells similar lamp, electrical elements, or you turn one corner and it's full of kind of engineering, sort of like the metal workshops. And it's really, they occupy really tiny space, but it's really interesting to see how they somehow like bring the tools out in the street, and they cut like the metal bars and so on. It's really interesting how they navigate the space, and that sort of like led me to think about how we move around space, how we travel. And I think that traveling in space kind of metaphorically led from my interest in sound. My concept of sound is about this sound traveling in space. This sort of like a melody, like the sound, like linear line that weaves through the air and vibrating the space. And that kind of concept kind of led to this idea about traveling. We travel so much, and at the time in Korea, the residency was sort of in the central city, but then it was quite out as well. So like I had to walk across this big park and then catch a bus to go to a subway train station, and then travel from there to wherever you go. And I remember I was there with like a couple of other international artists, and then we planned a day, and then we just end up just doing one thing, or like a grocery shopping would be our like a day plan, because so much of time spent on the road. And I sort of like, because I spent so much time on like the subway train, like as with other cities, like the train station, subway stations, they're pretty much looking pretty similar. They look quite similar, and then you have all this smartphone with the app that tells you like the color of the line of the subway train, and then the exit like the names and numbers, and so you start relying on this like the app where you travel with on unknown city. Because I never lived in Seoul, even I was born in Busan, which is the other part of Korea, and I really got interested in this kind of like entering one of the subway train station, and then when you're on the train, you don't have a sense of moving. You just go in and you go in the train, and then you come out of like exit what the app tells you, and then you're suddenly out of somewhere really completely different. And there's the idea of like going into an abstract space and then coming out, and somehow like time is lost in that traveling period, and I started to realize how our understanding of space is quite flattened through this kind of transportation, because one of my friends who just loved walking one day suggested we just walk along past a few, like 3 or 4 train stations, which wasn't that far a walk. And my understanding of that, say A to B by subway trains or just walking, it completely changed the way I understood that area. So it's very enriching to just walk. And then, and then start thinking about, traveling on the plane to Korea within 12 hours. And what if we didn't have this technology? Like, what if we didn't have, like, the cars and trains and planes? Our understanding of, like, living in this world and moving from A to B would be very, very different. And the In Transit series sort of based on those kind of thinking of these areas and the flattening. So like if you look at the In Transit series, like you see the sprawling of like stainless tubes and like with objects that kind of like reference different spaces, like that reference like the buses and like the outdoor and like inside domestic, and a kind of flattening, like coming together and in one space, and like collaging space, kind of like internet, like nowadays like we have all these kind of like the smartphones and internet where you can just flick an email to someone this opposite side of the world, and it feels quite, that space doesn't seem to exist. But back in the day, like you would write a letter. I remember like when I just immigrated to New Zealand, I remember like writing letters to my friend in Korea and then just waiting for that letters to arrive. And but now it seems more, that space sort of seems kind of flattened and disappeared. And I think the In Transit series sort of kind of speak to that, how we travel and how our movements are controlled and by these sort of systems.
So for anyone who hasn't seen any of the In Transit works, there are very large installations that consist of lots of vertical and horizontal stainless steel pipe and other objects similar to some in the room and domestic, like the handrails, but some have had beds and phone docking stations and tables, and could easily fill this entire gallery. That's sort of the scale we're talking about. But each iteration is slightly different, and the functionality of the objects in them are different. But I know they're all connected at their core about not only making space but connecting spaces. Things, the tubing might pop through walls and run along the floor and enter other spaces. But I think the story about the reason for the beds is quite an interesting one.
Like, so I had incorporated like bunk beds in most of the bigger scale installations, and I remember like, because New Zealand is so far away from the rest of the world, and I had this, I traveled to New York to see these amazing institutions earlier last year, and I remember like going to the Philadelphia Museum, and it's like 16-hour flight from here to New York, and then and the hour difference, like, you know, is complete opposite. So like I got really sleepy, I got really tired, like around like 2 o'clock, 3, and because Philadelphia was like 2 hours train from the New York City, like just couldn't go back to my accommodation and take a nap and come back, and it's a waste of time because, you know, I spent all that money and like time and travel there, and I couldn't just like spend the time napping. So like I forced myself to go to like this museums like every single day on like since I arrived on the day in the morning, and I got to a stage where I just couldn't walk. I just really need to sleep around 2 or 3. So like really, I really politely asked. And then there was like winter at the time, and like in the foyer, like sleeping in the foyer, it was too cold. And I kindly, politely asked one of the guard, like if I could take a nap in one of the benches in a very unpopular room in the Philadelphia Museum. It was like full of religious painting, and hardly no one was like there. And I politely asked the guard if I could just nap, you know, explaining that I'm from opposite part of the world, and I just can't function, and the foyer is too cold. And he was really friendly, so yeah, go for it, you know. And then I think like 20 or 30 minutes later, another guard, a lady, came and really rudely woke me up. She was sort of saying like, get up, like, you know, you're not supposed to, you know, sleep here, like as if I was like homeless. I mean, nothing wrong with the homeless, but like, and you know, when you're like extremely tired and someone like wakes you up, you get like extremely get angry. And I got really upset. Like even if someone gently wakes you up, you still kind of get irritated. But then, if you can imagine someone like just, you know, like yelling at you, like get up, so I got really upset, and I did make a complaint. Explain him, and at that incident really got me thinking, like, you know, these big museums need to consider this audience is traveling far away and from far, and it takes a bit of effort to look around the big museum and like the big events like biennales, and it's really tiring, and seats are not enough, and that, I think, reaffirmed my incorporation of bunk beds where people can sleep in museums. You're allowed to nap.
So you were developing your work for the Neon Biennale when we started talking about the residency here, and you were quite quick to sort of see the opportunity in the residency to move beyond the in-transit series. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your approach to the residency and coming to Dunedin on the back of that experience of the Biennale, which was in such a different space, like not a gallery space, and knowing that you've been 12 weeks here and what that opportunity kind of meant.
I just had a really interesting talk with my gallerist. Ryan was sitting just behind the audience. We talked about like, you know, when I was playing cello, like I remember like entering like a competition or like concert, like me and my tutor, I had a private tutor like for a long time. We would strategically plan our repertoire, like 3 or 4 pieces that one piece will show, like pronounce maybe my like technical aspect of my playing, but at the same time you need another piece that's really slow, very poetic, and to show that you're a performer with a wider, very spectrum in terms of performing, like you're able to do something really fast and speedy and passionate, but also be able to articulate the most fragile, most quiet emotions as well. And so we were talking about that, and I think going, looking, and when I approach every exhibition, it's like, you know, it's every context is different, and like out, for example, like the Lyon Biennale, they had to have a new venue this year because I think their contract finished and so on. So they found this kind of abandoned factory, which is like massive. Like it used to host like 3,000 workers, and it used to be operating as a washing machine factory. And I think over time, the owner passed on companies. It kind of failed, and so like basically it was an empty factory, and it was very wild. I'm not sure if you guys been to this Cocktail Island in Sydney Biennale. It's not as wild as that one, but it's quite similar. It's very industrial. It had all exposed like gantry cranes and concrete and graffitis all around, like 12 meters high ceilings and 20 meters, 30 meters of the length and the width, and just like a painter wouldn't survive in the environment, and doing something quite ambitious and big scale sort of made sense for that space. And whether when I saw the space in Dunedin, it didn't make sense to bring something like movement in this space. So like it was really about responding to different spaces, and I think I was at the time developing these little discrete objects about like a year ago, and it was when I had a show in Sydney, which is like filling and installed, and the gallery decided to collect the piece, and because all of my bigger scale installations were like one-off, which I don't mind. I don't mind like putting all that money, effort, time, energy for an exhibition, which will run maybe depending on maybe from like 1 month to up to 9 months, and then everything gets recycled. And I didn't mind that. I think it's worth putting everything for that amount of time. But the Sydney Art Gallery of New South Wales decided to collect the piece, but they couldn't collect the one that been shown there. So me and Ryan and the gallery, we start talking about some possibilities, making this work is collectible, and then through that process, the work sort of like divided into like small elements and components, and so it was more like a kit that we provided to the gallery where they could be fit together in different ways, like a puzzle piece, and through that process, it's sort of like the work was broken into elements and components, which sort of led to these group of small objects.
I know that your access to the workshops at the Dunedin School of Art had a really big impact on your ability to actually make this body of work. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your approach to making, in terms of, from the 3D modelling and design of each work, sourcing materials and identifying contractors or suppliers, through to like welding and actual physical construction.
So like with the bigger install, I think it depending on like the time you've got and like the scale of the exhibition, the process of production always sort of like shifts. And with a bigger install, I would hire an assistant welder, and I would maybe give engineering company a list of cutting lists to do. And but I was always heavily involved in the production process, and my metal skill has been developing. So every project, like my welding skill, is at another level. And I had an assistant welder. Her name is Diana, who actually went to Dunedin School of Art, and now she went to welding school, and she's doing apprenticeship at one of the biggest engineering company in Auckland. And she has the most tidy beautiful stitching, welding skill, and I always sort of admired that level of consistency, and she tried to teach me. And if she's 100% out now, like after the show, my welding skill probably maybe like 85. So I can sometimes get her consistency and sometimes not. But anyways, I never had a proper studio in Auckland. One of the reasons is that the rent is really expensive in Auckland, and I worked with a bigger scale, so I didn't really need one. And I was very fortunate working with going to engineering companies to work on piece, and I would always plan my work on my computer, and I used just really basic program called SketchUp. It's free to download, and the program really gave a lot of information in terms of what it can do in space. And but what was quite special about coming to Dunedin School of Art and having a studio space, which wasn't that big at all, like in my imagination to have a studio, I always thought I needed at least like 10 meters square space. But the space they given me were only like 5.5 by 6.5. I actually measured it, and I was really able to like use the space, like and I think looking at like how the engineering companies operate, I think I have built. I think now I'm able to kind of make a workshop, like organize a workshop how they can operate, and it wasn't a fancy thing as I was fearful of being really expensive and like you need everything, but actually like setting up a workshop was really simple thing. Over time I sort of slowly gather some tools that I need, like the welding machine and so on. So it was really interesting just to, because I set up the workshop at the art school, and it was really interesting. And also like back in Auckland, I'll spend like 2 hours at least one way, going to like maybe half an hour going to the workshop, my car, and unpacking my stuff from a pallet, so that I'd be more cautious navigating around the company doing their own thing, because they've been really generous to me, so I have to be really cautious, not interrupting their workflow. So it was really nice, and then I'll always after that unpacking, I'll start working my stuff, and then I'll spend another half hour repacking them and then travel back. So what was really interesting about this Dunedin being here in residence is that I could just leave where I left the day before and then just come back walking. It was a walking distance, and pick up. And that really led me really use the time really efficiently and really productive. And yeah.
This exhibition was very much about creating a series of works that would allow for similarities and differences across each form to sort of be highlighted and accentuated. How did you find the process of making multiple forms, where you had to consider each work as a sculpture in its own right, but also how they would speak to each other in this space?
I think as with the title Succession, like in the process of making these work, like it was quite interesting. One work would lead to another, like it would like this form will sort of like bounce off another form, and then it was with us very subtle changes. It would just kind of evolve naturally, and that progression sort of like it pronounced more during install. Like there was a clear sense like some form worked better next to another form. Like it was quite interesting how, because I think at the time during the drawing process you sort of don't really know how the structure function in space, but it was quite interesting to see how very subtle changes it shifts, and it's almost like like I was listening to this interview by the violinist. His name's It's a Perman, and he's a really interesting violinist. Like he's Jewish, and he has polio since he was like 4 years old. So he's really inspiring musician. And there's I was at the art school, and I was just like, there was one day, like the whole day, I was like really captivated by his performance, and also like his talk on his perspective on music. He talks about how classical musicians have different kinds of improvisation in comparison to like a jazz musician. Like for a jazz musician, like for them to improvise, even like the same piece, they will actually improvise, they'll actually play different notes and different things, and will actually be a very different piece. But for a classical musician to play same piece, but they don't actually play the same way. They have, and he calls that improvisation as their kinds of improvisation. Like it's a very subtle difference. It's same music, same notes, but it may be different in a way how he breathes, or just the way he phrases the same notes, or it's a very subtle changes. And I think that with these work, they're same material, similar objects, but their kinds of improvisation and evolving one after another was what I found really interesting to work with this new body of work.
And the role of the viewer has always been a really important part of your works, and how people navigate your work and interact with it. So how do you hope audiences come to Succession?
I think because these are so familiar objects, they're like the real world material. Like this stainless tubing is a universal material. You find it in parts in very small city in Korea, and you'll see one in like Paris, same material. Though the pipe diameters are quite different in Europe, they have different sizing, but they're same. And these objects, you live with them. They're like the everyday part of our everyday. And I guess I would want, because of the familiarity, I want the work to sort of like, I think everyone will bring different perspective on it, because we have all different kinds of memories and life experience with these objects in our life, and I think it will remind of us certain things. I think.
Well, I've got one more question, and then we'll open up the floor. Where do you think this project will take your practice next?
I think this work, the element of composition was always there in my practice. Like with the bigger projects and other work, there's always an element of kind of musical composition. But like with these new body work, somehow that element got more pronounced, and which is very interesting, I guess. Possibility for my practice. It really opens up many possibilities, and I think it has. What's interesting about this body work is that it's got indefinite potential to be many variations. Like it will be. I don't know how to say it, but I think it's got a huge potential to be in different contexts and evolve over time. And because I rarely work with white cube space, and I think the nature of my project, curators always got excited when they have really strange space, and maybe Yona can do something different here. But I think this body of work somehow be able to diversify the context of work exist and do different things.